Welcome to Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades. I'm Representative Gary Harper, and this is Sir Josh of Solomon.
Sir now.
Sir Josh.
You remembered my name and you added something new to it.
Yeah, that's how I remembered it.
Okay. Oh, I gotcha.
I have to add something to make you sound more official. So I'm not going to get into regular politics tonight because we have the Secretary of State with us tonight, Sir Bill of Gardner. But I do want to say, and I think Bill will agree with this, right now in history, there's a lot of difficulty for the voters. The real difficulty for the voters is trying to figure out what the truth is, because you're hearing polar opposites on almost every issue. And it's relentless and it's constant. So what I'd ask the people to do if they have a chance is read at least the summary report on the IG report. Just read the summary and then go watch the news. And from that, you'll be able to determine who is or isn't lying to you. Because it is so difficult to understand what's going on. We're at each other's throats. You know, some people say Republicans are all evil. Some people say Democrats are all evil. And that can't possibly be true, for one thing. And the fact of the matter is there's a lot of great people on both sides. So trying to arrive at the truth is a difficult thing right now. So if you read I've got it on Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades Facebook page, and on my Facebook page I have a link to the Inspector General report. Just read the summary and then go watch the news, and you'll be so much more informed than most people, and you'll have a good idea who is and isn't slinging BS.
That's actually good advice, regardless of what the topic is do your own research. Don't just listen to pundits. That's it.
Yeah. Anyway, enough of that. Bill Gardner, I was first elected in 2000, and I was a freshman legislator, and they said people might not understand, but the legislature votes for the Secretary of State. It's a joint legislature, right? The joint legislative Senate and House get together, and we all collectively vote for the Secretary of State. And so the people that I was looking to for advice, because I didn't know what I was doing, that hasn't changed, said, well, we're going to vote for Bill Gardner for Secretary of State. And I said, yeah, but he's a Democrat. That seems stupid. But I did what I was told because they knew what they were doing and I didn't. And it's been an honor to vote for you every 2 years that I'm up there. I mean, absolutely honor. You are one of the most honorable human beings in Concord, and you do such an amazing job. Every now and again, I'll find that he's got a moment to spare, and I'll go in and talk to him. And every single time, I wish I brought a tape recording, because there's so much information that he has in that noggin of his that within a minute or two, my brain's already filled and I can't take in anymore, and he's still going. And it's an honor to have you on the show.
Gary, I'm listening to you. I'm thinking of Matlock.
So anyway, when I was
underestimated, you're underestimated.
Yeah, my wife says so too. So I think it was around 2004. I went. You were doing a thing on the New Hampshire primary, the history of the New Hampshire primary, and I was very impressed. So I'd like the reason I wanted you on the show is to tell the people about the New Hampshire primary. How did it start? You know, how did we get here?
Well, this primary coming up soon in 2020 will mark the 100th anniversary of New Hampshire having the first in the nation primary. The first primary was in 1916, but it wasn't first. It was never planned to be first. It was a small town, small farmer by the name of Stephen Bullock same name as one of the candidates on the ballot, who filed but who has since pulled out. But his name will still be on the ballot.
Okay.
He is the one responsible for having the presidential primary. And
what
he
did he do?
put a bill in. He was from Richmond.
Yeah.
Richmond's right on the Mass border over in Cheshire County.
Yeah.
And he didn't want the big shots making the decisions all the time. He wanted the average person to be able to have a say in who would be the delegates to attend the national conventions for each party.
Okay.
And so he put a bill in saying that any person in the state who was a registered member of the party and was a registered voter could go to the Secretary of State's office, pay $10, and get his name on the ballot. Because the first two primaries in 16 and in 1920, only men could vote. So of the...
I should make some comment there.
I don't think you should.
Okay, well,
And and that was it. He put the bill in, and it passed, and so that's how it started. But he put in his legislation that the primary would be in May, and that was in 1913. So 2 years later, a representative from Bethlehem by the name of Glessner,
yeah.
he decided that it would save the towns some money by having the presidential primary at the same time as the town meeting election.
Right.
And so he amended the bill, put a new bill in, amending the law by changing the date from May to the second Tuesday of March, which is our traditional town election date. And that passed, and so a year later, we had the first primary. It wasn't a significant event at all. It was new, but for the first time, any person who was registered in the party had a chance to be a delegate.
So prior to that, delegates from each state went to the national convention and they chose who was going to be the candidate for that party.
For president, and they were selected by the big shots, so
But
to speak.
anybody could go, or who decided what delegates went to
Well,
the
it
national
was
convention?
usually the party leaders or elected officials.
So amongst themselves rather than from a public.
Right.
Got
It
it.
was not a public vote.
Gotcha.
It was a group of individuals who were either elected officials or leaders in the party.
Because that's what
I see.
Andrew Jackson got upset by when they elected Adams, because
Yes.
Jackson felt as though the people would have supported him, but the party insiders were the ones who decided, and he never had a
And
chance.
New Hampshire had the most significant role in all of that back then, because when Andrew Jackson was serving his first term, his vice president was John C. Calhoun.
Yeah,
And just about every decision that Jackson made, Calhoun opposed. And Calhoun had a lot of friends in the House and in the Senate.
yeah,
And Jackson would veto a bill, and Calhoun, his vice president, would come out and say, well, that was stupid. He shouldn't have done that. I wouldn't do that. And so there was some concern that Jackson might not be nominated again, that what was taking place then as the nomination process for the country was called the King Caucus. And it was the same kind of situation. U.S. senators, people in Washington would make the decision who the nominee would be. So because Jackson had upset a lot of members of the House and Senate, it was so bad that Andrew Jackson actually nominated a person from New York by the name of Martin Van Buren
yeah.
to be minister to England. And in the confirmation vote, the vice president presides over the Senate.
Yeah.
The deciding vote was his vice president voting against them. So when that happened, people were really concerned, Jackson supporters. And so what happened here in New Hampshire at what was called the Eagle Coffee House, right across the street from the State House,
Okay, yeah.
in June of 1831, there was a meeting of all the elected Andrew Jackson supporters. They were called Republican Democrats. It was Republican first and there's two words. That's how he was the first term. Then Jackson eventually eliminated Republican. So they had this meeting. And Franklin Pierce, who was Speaker of the House in 1831, he was 26 years old, the youngest person to this day to serve as Speaker of the House. So think about that.
Yeah.
It's that's a pretty rare. Well, he was part of a 10-member committee that came up with an idea to change the way presidents would be nominated in the future. And they had a proposal. And that convention at what was now, it's now called the Eagle Hotel. There's still the sign up there, but it was the Eagle Coffee House then. And they passed it. And what it said was that we call on the country to change the way presidential candidates get nominated. Instead of this King Caucus, and it was derisively referred to it, the King Caucus, because
Right.
few people making the decision. So he said, we propose that there be a national convention. And we propose that it be in Baltimore. Now, this was in June of 1831. We propose that it begin next year on the third Monday of May in 1832, 11 months later. And we propose that the states send delegates equal to the number of electors in the state. And half the states would have to agree to this in order for it to happen,
Right.
and some of the proposed rules. So New Hampshire sent that out, that proposal, that summer. And there was debate among the states. There were 30 states at the time. Pennsylvania said, we will approve this, but we would like the location to be changed from Baltimore to Harrisburg. And New Jersey actually required that New Hampshire give an explanation why it had done this in the first place. Did New Hampshire have some candidate for vice president that it was going to try to impose on the delegates? So it ended up that all but one state sent delegates on that day, that third Monday of May in 1832. And at that convention, and this is a story very few people in New Hampshire know because it wasn't written about at the time, just like the sponsor of the primary legislation.
Yeah.
People just didn't know that. So the local paper was called the Baltimore Republican. And on Tuesday, the day after that third Monday in May of 1832, that Baltimore Republican had an article that was reprinted a couple of weeks later by the Concord Patriot, now the Concord Monitor. And in that, and that's where the source is. And in that article, the reporter from Baltimore said, yesterday, here at the Athenaeum, and that Athenaeum is still there in Baltimore, delegates from all across the country met in convention. And because New Hampshire is credited with coming up with this idea, it was fitting that the call of the convention, the call of the roll of the states, and the opening address was given by a New Hampshire delegate by the name of Frederick Augustus Sumner from Charlestown. And then it went on to, it actually took a lot of what he said. And it was incredible reading the speech. People back then, I mean, that was, life was very different. And there were much...
So he didn't just tweet it
No.
out.
And it was all about why New Hampshire did this. That it wasn't any self-interest. It was just to get more people to be able to be part of this process. So the state that didn't participate was the farthest away, Missouri,
Okay.
and all the rest did, and that
They didn't-
national convention, the Democrats preceded the Republicans,
Yeah.
and so the convention, that proposal came from, now I wasn't going to talk about that, but when you brought up, I didn't know you were going to bring up Andrew Jackson, but so what happened was Jackson was concerned, and his kitchen cabinet was concerned that Calhoun would take the nomination. But they knew they had the people. You mentioned Jackson and
Right.
the people. So they wanted a way to get more people to be part of this. And Franklin Pierce, who was a leading Democrat, grabbed a hold of that and made New Hampshire be the place to propose to the country to make this change. And that's how it happened.
That's actually really cool.
So that first convention, it was a single party convention, or was it? It was,
Single party, just for the Democrats.
yeah.
And they nominated Andrew Jackson.
Okay. That's actually that's really interesting. So then, so from there on in, we started from there on in, we had delegates that went to a federal convention and nominated their candidates, and then they would go around the country and tell everybody.
We would have delegates, the party leaders, the political leaders of the time would pretty much decide who they would be.
Yeah.
And those delegates would go to the convention. Now, those conventions, from 1832 right up into the 1900s, you needed a 3/4 vote in order to win the nomination.
Right.
And so you tended to get consensus candidates. And Franklin Pierce, who was instrumental in doing this as a 26-year-old speaker, 20 years later, he gets nominated on the 49th ballot.
49th ballot?
The 49th ballot in the summer of 1852.
Okay.
And he becomes a nominee. And before that, Franklin Pierce was elected to everything he ever ran for. He was the youngest member of the House, the youngest speaker. When he was in the House, his father was governor. That's the only time it's happened. There's been governor like Governor Hugh Gregg had his son, but there's been governors, but not at the same time.
Right.
So Franklin Pierce's father, Benjamin, was governor while he was a member.
Yeah.
So Franklin Pierce then went on to be the youngest member of the U.S. House. He was over 25, but less than 30. And just over 30, he became, when he was elected to the U.S. Senate, became the youngest member of the U.S. Senate. And then when he was elected president in 1852, he was the youngest person to ever be elected president, and that continued another 50 years until Teddy Roosevelt.
Right.
But he was not elected the first time. He became president because President McKinley was assassinated.
Right.
So
right.
Franklin Pierce had this tremendous political heritage of,
Right.
but they had 3 children, 3 boys. And when the second boy died, his second son, his wife asked him to come back to New Hampshire. He only had 1 son left and get out of this political life.
Yeah, yeah.
And so he did. And he had a tremendous position down there because he chaired the committee that decided what Revolutionary War veterans would get pensions when he was in the Senate. And so we got to hear all these stories about the Revolution from different parts of the country. But he resigned. Well, in the summer of 1852, he gets word that they've nominated him for president. And his wife said, "You cannot do this. You've promised me that you would not be in political life anymore. And he couldn't convince her. I mean, he said, how can they can't do this? They've already done it. They can't come back. You know,
Yeah, he understands the
he
process.
understands it. So she was never accepting of it. And his best friend was Nathaniel Hawthorne, famous American literature author. So he wrote a quick political biography of Franklin Pierce, which became his, because in those days they didn't go out and solicit votes. The people, it wasn't right. They didn't think people that appeared to be ambitious were people that should be the ones that
Yeah, you want people who are
hold
humble,
office.
humble people.
Well, people, you know, people made that decision. The people had a different sense about the best characteristics of people. That
Right.
you didn't want someone that was aggressively trying to completely change. But that's the way it was then. So what happened? He ends up, didn't have to go out and do much of the campaigning. But his wife, who was in Appleton, and her father was the president of Bowdoin when Franklin Pierce was a student at Bowdoin College. They had relatives in Massachusetts. So at Christmas they went down to visit, because swearing in those years was in March. On the way back, the train they were on derailed, and their son was killed right in front of them with a door sliding, just decapitated. So she was never the same again.
I can see
She
that.
didn't want him to go to Washington. It was a horrendous time for him, and her sister actually tried to help out so that there would be someone there with Franklin. So it's a sad story of a person who was successful every time he sought office in New Hampshire.
Or even when he didn't.
And even when yeah. So anyway,
That's really weird because you look, because
he's our only president. He was the 14th. He was the youngest. But an interesting thing about him, that some years after Bill Clinton served his second term, he was at the Pierce Manse one night, and there were only about a dozen members of the Pierce Brigade, it's called, people trying to keep that home, preserve the home up there. And someone asked him about Franklin Pierce, and he said, you know, before I ran for president, I read a biography of every single person who had been president. And there's only two presidents that come from small states. Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire and me from Arkansas. And he said, what is notable about Franklin Pierce is that every decision, and you make a lot of decisions in the White House. You're making decisions he was explaining what it was like day to day. And he said, so you have all these decisions. But there are some periods of time in our history where there's no good choices. And Franklin Pierce was president during one of those times. So even though when he had to make a choice, he picked the best of the choices, the one that.
yeah.
But in history, it goes down as something not good, awful,
Right.
bad for the country, and he was describing that, and it was really interesting for me to listen to that, because the way he put it. Now, the difference between Franklin Pierce and Abraham Lincoln, for instance. I mean, Franklin Pierce was wrong on the most significant moral issue of that day.
Yeah.
And he didn't have slaves. He didn't think it was right personally to have slaves. But his position was that because the Constitution was ratified, and at the time there were slaves in states,
Yeah.
and those states should be able to retain the slaves. Abraham Lincoln felt the same way. But the difference between the two of them was Abraham Lincoln said, I'll go along with the slaves in the South, but you're not going to take them west. So you're not going to create new states that are slave states in the West. And Franklin Pierce took the position that the slaves that were there, they could be slaves somewhere else. So that was the difference between the two. And Franklin Pierce paid a huge price in his later life.
Well, the thing is as I went through the what was the slave that went to the Supreme Court to say
Dred
that
Scott.
Dred Scott.
Frederick Douglass.
I went through read the Dred Scott case again, and the thing that really sticks out to you from the Dred Scott case and Franklin Pierce is the correct thing to do would be to amend the Constitution, because there's no way you could read the Constitution in 1850 and not understand that slavery was constitutional. You have to, at that point, the correct thing to do, instead of ignoring the Constitution, would be to have amended it, and it would have resolved all of this. But they didn't do that. They did end runs around it and tried to do patchwork.
Well, it's something very similar today. This popular vote idea.
Right.
The Constitution, there's a reason why we have electors. It's in the
Yeah.
Constitution. It was one of the most difficult decisions that the members of the Constitutional Convention that George Washington
that
presided
debate
over.
actually went on for
because they
years.
didn't. No, they had. No one had ever done this before, where the people would actually elect the leader of the country, and because they had no experience, they couldn't come up with a way to do it. And several times, they had a resolution that said, "Look, we'll let the Congress pick the president." And every time they passed that, there were a group of delegates that said, "You can't. You got to give the people a role in this process."
Right.
But they couldn't figure it out. That's why it was at the end, in that summer, one of the last things. And before they came up with this idea, somebody said, "Well, why don't we just let the governors? Let the governors meet and let the governors pick one of them, and that'll be the president." And the same group said, "No, you got to give the people a role." So they gave the people a role by letting the states choose electors. They didn't tell the states how to do it. It was unique what happened in New Hampshire about that. And we almost didn't participate in the first presidential election because there was a disagreement between the House and Senate how to actually choose electors. So to get back to your point about this popular vote idea now is to have the states get around the Constitution by coming up with a compact instead of respecting the Constitution.
They're trying to do an end run.
And changing it, like you suggested back then, 100-some years ago. They want to come up with this idea that the states will make sort of backroom deals and say, "Look, we'll have our electors vote for the winner of the country, not the winner of the state," and it's just disrespectful of the Constitution.
It's disrespectful of your own voters.
Well, yeah, that
Because
too.
because
That too.
because that in that theory, New Hampshire is pretty moderate. So basically, if New Hampshire did that, we could have a situation where Joe Biden gets 51% of the vote in New Hampshire, and Donald Trump gets 49% of the vote in New Hampshire. But then it goes to the national convention, and all of a sudden, New Hampshire has to vote completely for Donald Trump, because that's what the national popular vote went, or vice versa. Either way, you've disrespected the 51% of New Hampshire residents who voted for Joe Biden. It's an end run around the Constitution. So if you don't like it, amend it.
So Frederick Douglass,
Okay.
you know, in the House of Representatives, John Parker Hale's portrait.
No,
Well, his portrait is as you're facing the speaker.
I know I'm supposed to say yes when somebody
The
says
the farthest one on the left.
We've
There's
only been here
five
for
portraits
20
up there.
years.
4 of them are presidents:
Yeah.
Washington, Lincoln, Franklin Pierce. You've got, and John Parker Hale is on the left.
Okay.
He was the first U.S. senator to call for the abolition of slavery on the Senate floor. And I tell this story when people say New Hampshire's not representative. This primary, you people are not like the rest of the country. But there's all kinds of things in our history that show what New Hampshire has done contributing to social advances. So John Parker Hale was the first guy to do that. His statue...
What year would that have been?
18... In the 1850s.
Okay.
I don't know exactly what year.
Yeah, that's all right. I'm curious what...
But his statue is in front of the State House. If you go out the front door, the first statue on the left,
Okay.
Webster is in front of you,
Yeah.
is John Parker Hale.
Okay.
And when that statue was unveiled in 1892, Frederick Douglass came to that event. He was very old. He came to that event, and the Secretary of State of New Hampshire at that time wrote...
That wasn't you?
Wrote what he said, and we have that. And at the beginning, Frederick Douglass was a Republican because most blacks were Republicans.
Yeah.
And in that summer, the Republican National Convention was in Minneapolis. Like it was 8 years ago. The second time it was in Minneapolis. The first time was that summer of 1892. So he gets up and he said, I shouldn't be here. I'm old, I'm frail, I haven't been feeling good, but I couldn't stay away from this because this man has done more for my people than anyone except Abraham Lincoln. I traveled with him. He told stories about him, and what he said was, I want to tell you what it was like for me 50 years ago in the 1840s when I visited your state. He said, I went to many of the churches, and some of the churches still have the window where they have on it that Frederick Douglass spoke there.
Oh, really?
And he said, at that time, I could be at Bunker Hill and be chained and dragged back to where I was supposed to be. I could be at Saratoga. I could be at the most historic places in this country. And that's all changed now. For me, feel like I'm living in heaven while I'm still on earth because of the changes that have occurred in this country, and I have witnessed how governments can turn upside down overnight. And a lot of the phrases that Martin Luther King used back in the 1960s
Yeah.
were in that speech of his.
Oh, really?
Very similar, but about the mountaintops and the valleys and
that's
incredible speech that Douglass gave about his experiences, and
Oh, that's wicked cool.
that's his statute.
But we're going to run out of time, so we also got now. This is see what I go through every time I sit down with a guy. I know it's brutal. So, 1920, we have the first primary in New Hampshire in March, and
No, the first in the nation.
first in the nation primary, and that's just to vote for delegates.
For delegates. But the delegates were
convention.
grouped. If they had a candidate they were supporting,
Yeah.
the delegates were grouped with that candidate's name, but you couldn't vote directly for the candidate. You could only vote for the delegates.
Right.
So in that primary in 1920, the first winner of the New Hampshire primary was a fellow by the name of Leonard Wood.
Okay.
Leonard Wood was a national hero. Leonard Wood was the head of the Rough Riders. People think that Teddy Roosevelt was his second in command.
Oh.
And the owner of the Manchester Union Leader, Frank Knox, was also a Rough Rider in that same group.
Oh, okay. Wow.
So when Leonard Wood won the primary here. The newspapers, particularly the Manchester Union Leader, had banner stories about our favorite son, our native son, and because Leonard Wood was born in New Hampshire.
Okay.
Now, Leonard Wood was the head of the Rough Riders. He then became governor of Cuba. He became governor general of the Philippines. And they were having a hard time back then to capture Geronimo. He had been like 15 years out and people couldn't. So Leonard Wood, when he came back, said okay, and he captured him. So he became pretty famous. There's Fort Wood in Missouri. There's some other forts that. Well, anyway, he's running. He signs up, and he wins. But he won as the favorite son. How was he a native person in New Hampshire? His mother was on a train. On their way back, they lived in a small town on Cape Cod, and she was expecting, and the baby wasn't waiting. So they had to get her off the train at the next stop, and that stop happened to be Winchester,
Oh,
New Hampshire.
wow. Okay.
And it was at the post office. So they had her go up to a room above the post office, and she had her son, and she stayed there 3 months with her son until she was better, he was better. And that was the only time he lived in New Hampshire. But the newspapers made it as though he was, you know, he was native. He was a native born.
What are
and
they saying
he
now?
ended up winning 9 of the 12 primaries, but at the convention, his major opponent was Hiram Johnson, a senator from California.
Yeah.
And at the convention, they went for a person who wasn't involved in any of the primaries, Warren Harding. Harding became the nominee and was
Wow.
elected president. So that's the 1920 presidential primary here. And the rest of them until 1952 were not national events. They were pretty much just New Hampshire
Okay.
events.
When you say they're not national, you mean that other states weren't having primaries at the time?
No, because like this time, I think there are 8 states now that have eliminated primaries on the Republican side. Because what happened when the primary was a creature of the 20th century? The idea came from a governor in Wisconsin, Robert La Follette. And so Wisconsin is the one that first state to have a primary. And then it became, it just, in a matter of half a dozen years, almost every state in the country had a primary. But then what happened was when one party controlled the House and Senate and the governor's office, and they had an incumbent president running for re-election, they didn't want to pay for it. And they didn't want to pay for the other party's primary. So state after state got rid of the primary. So by 1952, there were about a dozen states that had
It still had primaries. Okay.
Even in 68, there were 14 states that had primaries. That was it. But New Hampshire, the people wanted this and were willing to fund it every 4 years. And New Hampshire never took it from any other state. It just fell into it because in 1916, we were not first. Indiana was actually first by a week, and Minnesota was the same day. And so this time during the filing period, I told the mayor of South Bend, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, and I told Vice President Pence, because they're both from Indiana. And I said, when they filed at different times, they said, are you aware that if Indiana had kept its law, you'd be filing in Indiana, not here in New Hampshire? 'Cause Pence was filing on behalf of President Trump.
Right.
And neither one, they were, no, I didn't know that, I didn't know that. And when Senator Klobuchar came in, I mentioned to her about Minnesota, that if Minnesota had kept it, they were the same day, but they didn't. So Indiana moved it to May, and by 1920, and Indiana did that. Minnesota got rid of it. So in 1920, by default, we had the first primary, and we've had it first ever since.
So what was the big move to move away from voting for delegates and actually voting for candidates?
It was the 1948 primary was the last primary that just had delegates that could be voted for on the ballot. So from 1916 through 1948, it was I call it the quiet era of the primary, because it was an indirect vote. But in 1949, the Speaker of the House, Richard Upton, he proposed that the House pass legislation that would allow the people of New Hampshire to vote directly for president, in addition to the delegates. So the delegates would still come in and file and be on the ballot, but there'd be a separate column of just the names for president. And that passed. And so that's why the 1952 primary was the first one where you could vote directly for president. And on this poster, you see at the top of this poster, commemorating all of this the 100 years, every person who has served as president of our country since 1952 has won at least one New Hampshire presidential primary. One has actually won 3 of them, but every one has won at least one, and that's remarkable.
So
Now, since 1952, there's been 17 presidential primaries. Of the 17, 14 of the winners that year they won became president. And the other 3 came in second and became president. But each of those then went on to win a New Hampshire primary. That's why we can say that but it's an incredible record that since 1952. Now, sometimes the press decreed a winner who didn't really win the most votes. And that happened in 1968.
Okay.
When the incumbent president, Lyndon Johnson, got the most votes. But Eugene McCarthy, who was his opponent, he won more delegates. So the story out of New Hampshire was the winner of the primary was the one that won the most delegates, not the one who won the most votes.
Right.
But that primary had a huge impact on the country, because in 1968, the next primary wasn't until April. So there was several weeks, and Iowa wasn't in the picture. They were in late March, early April, their caucus. So 2 weeks after the primary, the president goes on national television and says, I'm all done. I'm not running anymore. I won't accept the nomination. I'm done. And when that happened, the eyes of the country, of the people in the country, were on New Hampshire. Like, my goodness, this is unbelievable.
What did you guys do?
The little guy can change the course of history. The little guy can actually make a difference. Why don't we have that?
Okay.
Why don't we do it here? And so that began what I call the cycle, the challenging era. And what happened with it, right away, the first year, the first state to take action was Nevada. And it was a 27-year-old Harry Reid, who was a member of the Nevada House of Representatives. He shepherded a bill through the House and Senate that would have Nevada in 1972, 3 years later, after 68, the next president's primary, go 1 week ahead of New Hampshire. But the bill was vetoed by the governor. And the governor gave his reasons why he was vetoing it. And it was because he had talked to the New Hampshire governor about the tradition and the history, and he said, I don't want to create ill will with a sister state, and even if we were successful to do this, some bigger state would come and take it away from us in 4 years, so I don't want any part of it. So that was the first. Then a year and a half later, Florida, the legislature there, the members said, we don't have to go a week ahead of them. If we have it on the same day in March, where do you think those candidates would rather be in December, January, February? And they passed it. That became law.
Yeah.
So our legislature had about 3 weeks left in the session, and the Speaker of the House, Marshall Cobley, at the time, saved a legislation because the Speaker of the House of Florida had told him, it was Speaker Pettigrew, told him that they were going to do this. So he waited, and as soon as they did it, they changed the date of town meeting by moving it up by a week, because the law was based on whatever town meeting, and town meeting was always the second Tuesday of March.
Right.
So they changed the law, so in 72, our town meeting was a week ahead of Florida.
So they didn't have to put in a bill that had anything to do with a primary, just the state town meeting.
That's right.
I like these stories. It sounds like not only is New Hampshire first in the nation chronologically with the primaries, but it sounds like we took the lead in creating the primary process, especially in 1952 when we gave the vote to the people rather than just vote delegates.
Well, it's considered the first modern primary, where the voters in New Hampshire could actually vote directly for a president. Before that, they could vote indirectly. They could look for the candidate and the delegates that were pledged to support that. But a lot of elected officials ran unpledged, and so it was indirect. It became a direct vote for president in 1952.
Right. Oh, that's what I'm saying. So we are first in the nation, both chronologically, but also with the process. We've kind of helped define how we choose president, how individual states choose president. We set the example for Nevada and Florida, and that's
and it's been evolutionary. I mean, it's evolved over time, and in the legislature, because a few years after that, we had in one cycle 2 states that actually had laws that said that their primary would be the same day as New Hampshire whenever New Hampshire had the primary. And those states were Arizona and Delaware. And so people saying, oh my goodness, how are we going to do this? But the legislature has been willing to streamline the process, give the Secretary of State an authority to make the decision with flexibility. And that has made all the difference, that we have been able to. So in the instance of the 2 states, Arizona, it was just by happenstance. I got a call from a woman one day, and she said, I'm from Center Harbor. You don't know me, but my brother is the governor of Arizona, and I will take care of my brother. He will not offend New Hampshire's tradition. And within a month, the governor of Arizona explained to the people of Arizona that in the northern part of Arizona there was this Indian reservation, several reservations. But in January, it was rough going up there. And because they were under the Voting Rights Act, there were all kinds of complications, and they could not keep up with New Hampshire if New Hampshire was going to move into January, which we were going to do. So that took care of, she was right, she did it, Arizona. But Delaware was a different story. And Delaware is a really fascinating story because the 1996, both of these were, they passed their laws in the spring of 92, saying that they would, for the next cycle, for 96, that they would be the same day as New Hampshire. Well, when 96 was in front of us in the fall of 95, Bill Clinton was president. And we had a filing period in December. And Delaware had their filing period, but it ended a week later than ours. So the Republicans all said they would not participate, they would not file in Delaware. But I was waiting for the president to make his decision whether he was going to file. And there was a lot of people saying that he could not do that to a state. He couldn't just disregard a state. But in the end, he made the decision that he would not file in the Delaware primary in deference to New Hampshire's tradition. And so when that happened in December, 2 weeks later, the Delaware House and Senate came into session. The House was controlled by the Republicans, and the Senate was controlled by the Democrats. And there was a Democratic governor. And what they did was they passed a resolution saying that their filing period was null and void because they didn't have the candidates. A former governor of Delaware, who was in his 80s, ran for president saying, I'm going to do this, but vote for me, but you're really voting for the president, not for me. So they got ticked off that this happened to them. So they said it never happened. They just decreed by a resolution that it never happened. And they said, all you people running who have accepted federal matching funds, we have the right to make you be on our ballot, even if you won't file. So they made him be on the ballot. And when they made him be on the ballot, the candidates all said, we're not going to have any part of this. We're not going to have any part of this.
Bill, we got 1 minute.
Oh, my goodness.
I know. But is there anything you'd like to, we have like 30 seconds. Is there anything you'd like to?
So anyway, this primary on the ballot, it's a commemorating the 100th anniversary of New Hampshire having the first in the nation primary. So it's a special commemorative type ballot.
Yeah,
that
people
everyone
should
will
make
get.
sure they get out and vote in this primary just to
But I
be
can't-
part of that
I can't
100th
take the
year.
ballot home with me as a souvenir.
They'll get out. There are 50 candidates, 33 Democrats running, and
Yeah.
17 Republicans. And the names are rotated so that they have equal chance of being first and last, and all the places in between. We will have absentee ballots available by Christmas.
Nice.
And most people don't vote by absentee. 95% vote on that day because they want to watch everything and they want to do the right thing. The people here care about that decision. They know how important it is. They know what the record is of the state, of their choice in the end. So it's and in 1920 there was a blizzard. And Leonard Wood was stuck in Connecticut, couldn't get up here
To vote.
because for 3 days everything was shut down. But they still had the primary.
Right. Hey, we gotta go. Bill Gardner, you're the
Thanks, Bill.
awesomest guy I get to vote for. We'll see you guys next week.